The planet's puppet masters almost surely have a plan. There's clearly maybe something there beyond the realm of man. And until we've thoroughly tested every last close-chested view, I find the more we think we know, the less we really do. Where would we be without THC? 'Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Oh, where would we be without THC? The Higher Side Chat Show. Greg Carwood and Company.
Serenity now, Higher Side Chatters. From the Sunshine State, I'm Greg Carlwood. And while I'm not sure I agree with those who say we all died in 2012, I will say it wouldn't have been a bad place to pause the timeline. Even better would have been somewhere in the late 90s, just before the technocracy got to work on infecting our every waking moment with manipulative devices that project a never-ending scroll of attention-grabbing nonsense, overhyped headlines, anger-inducing algorithms, and a fire hose of infinite, uneducated opinions we didn't realize we were so lucky to live without. It felt like there was just a bit more cultural glue holding us together back then, and from its first episode on September 10th, 1993, The X-Files' 13-year run was a big part of what made that decade so interesting. It wasn't the only show, or even the first, to fold in nearly every theme of the conspiratorial counterculture, but few weaved a tapestry so rich that apparently even the CIA started to wonder where some of these ideas were coming from. Secret cabals, covert alien invasions, hybrids, implants, mind control, brain-scrambled assassins, lab-engineered viruses, black goo, secret cosmic wars, super soldiers, and a cornucopia of conspiratorial goodness right smack in the middle of prime time, not so subtly reminding viewers to question everything and not to trust what you're told on the surface. Something they don't really let happen these days. Well, our good pal Chris Knowles of Secret Sun fame not only co-wrote the complete X-Files behind the series The Myths and the Movies back in 2008, but he's hot off the presses with a new deep dive into the show titled XF Ultra, The X-Files, Conspiracy Culture, and the National Security State, which explores its cultural impact and the stranger-than-fiction real-world stories that the show sometimes pulled from or even inspired. So let's go. The X-Files obsessed, deep-diving synchro-mystic decoder and cultural scryer extraordinaire, Chris, welcome back.
Oh, it's so great to be back. So great. Always great to be on THC. In more ways than one.
Yes, indeed. And congrats on getting a new book out there. So dense with details and an entire episode by episode exploration of such an iconic show covering all our favorite conspiratorial subject matter. You co-wrote the complete guide 8 years ago, and it certainly seems like this is a more raw, unsanctioned exploration that Disney or Fox wouldn't actually probably endorse. But I did hope we can mainly explore some of the real world stuff that often was inspiration for the show. But let me just say, getting ready for this thing, I looked up when the X-Files pilot aired, and it was September 10th, 1996, exactly 32 years to the day of the Charlie Kirk shooting, an event peppered with Freemasonic symbolism. And that right out of the gate is just a very odd sync that I'm still thinking about. I haven't revisited the themes of the pilot to see if there's even more alignment, but just that alone is very weird.
It really is. I can't think of any parallels in the pilot itself. I mean, there are other episodes that you could probably look to, but the pilot itself is basically straight up. The whole dialogue is about aliens, but you don't see any aliens, really. I think it's, as I lay out in the book, I think that people are watching the series wrong. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is to get people to watch the series correctly.
Okay.
I mean, there's so much going on. There's so many layers. There's so much going on beneath the surface. There are so many, you talked about all those themes and such that we saw presaged in the X-Files, but there's a lot more than that. It's an incredible rabbit hole. And I really wanted people to, particularly people who want to get into it, that's kind of what I was aiming towards, which is why I have that very detailed episode guide. But I want people, to understand what they're looking at. A lot of things we see on television, we're just like, oh, whatever. And it just everything just sort of goes through, we're so bombarded with information all day. I think a lot of people throughout the years since day one have kind of overlooked what is going on. Now, the interesting thing about Charlie Kirk's assassination is that I was actually going to publish on that day. I was having terrible troubles with a Kindle app, which is just the most ridiculous app in the world. So I wanted, my original release date was that day. And, it's a good thing I didn't put it on that day, because it just would have been totally overshadowed. And to be honest with you, I was really kind of waiting to publish until all that sort of died down in the news.
We were going to talk about one other thing related to the Charlie Kirk assassination. As you said that, if we were going to touch on that, because it is such a huge cultural event, it has nothing to do with the book except for this weird date sync. But you said we could draw parallels with Kyle Odom and Kirk's assassination. I had to remind myself of that situation, but via Wikipedia, for context, it says on March 6, 2016, Kyle Odom, an individual fixated with alien conspiracy theories, shot Pastor Tim Remington 6 times in the back and once in the head at Altar Church, believing that Remington was hiding shape-shifting extraterrestrials within his congregation. Odom approached Remington in the parking lot of Altar Church and fired at him 6 times with a .45 caliber pistol in an apparent attempt on his life. Despite plans to kill outreach pastor John Padula, Odom left the scene without any further incident. Remington survived and underwent several hours of surgery. Odom mailed a manifesto to his family and media outlets expressing his intent to murder Remington and his belief that he was part of an alien conspiracy to enslave humanity. Police found his vehicle at the scene of the crime. After successfully evading police, Odom boarded a flight to Washington, D.C. and approached the White House, at which point he began tossing items over the fence, including flash drives and a 25-page manifesto addressed to the then United States President Barack Obama. Odom was apprehended by United States Secret Service members at 8:27 p.m., though the arrest was related to his activity at the White House and not on the attempt of Remington's life. In July 2017, Odom pleaded guilty to aggravated battery with a felony firearm and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 10 of those years are fixed, and after he will be eligible for parole. So, very interesting story. It does sound like the plot of an X-Files episode, but how is there any parallels really to the Charlie Kirk situation?
Well, I think the obvious one is like an attempted assassination of a religious leader.
Fair.
But there's also a political connection there, because Ted Cruz had spoken at Altar Church the day before. So there's that connection, Republican Party, the religious right, Christianity, so many different layers that I was really thinking about. And also the fact that he had like this just very strange motivation. He had this worldview where shape-shifting Martians that were sexually obsessed were taking over people's bodies, possessing people. And I guess they were like the ghosts of Martians or something. And it's interesting because he drew a cartoon of one of the Martians in one of his manifestos, and it looked eerily like Keck or Pepe the Frog. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And you might want to pull that up for your visuals, right?
Taking a note right now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And a lot of people on 4chan sort of pointed that out as well. That happened shortly after the season finale of season 10 of the X-Files, which was the so-called event season. And that episode was the one that a lot of people have been looking at as sort of a prediction of COVID, because it's all about this pandemic, this Spartan virus that's going to, kill off everybody. But there's all this stuff. I mean, Chris Carter was taken terrible abuse from the media, because he's talking about like chemtrails being used to distribute an airborne virus and electricity and all these kind of things. And then also people like drawing sigils in certain areas that have already been infected. I mean, it's this whole thing, this character that is partly very much based on Alex Jones. I think he's also partly based on Richard Dolan, because a lot of his presentation was paraphrasing Richard Dolan's speech at the Secret Space, I guess, conference, whatever, in 2015, the one that Dark Journalist had hosted.
The one in San Mateo? Just to let me throw this out there. I was there, and that is when I met Tom DeLonge in the parking lot, and I was so not expecting to meet Tom DeLonge. I was like, hey, you're one of the Blink-182 guys. And I think I used a different name, and he was like, no, I'm the other one. I was like, oh, all right. Well, interesting that you're here. And
You thought
then
he was Mark Hoppus?
yeah, and that was way before. I just couldn't remember the name because I hadn't thought about Blink in a long time. And that was before To the Stars or anything like that was happening. Just a weird little personal sync with what did become a big part of the disclosure movement that came from that same conference.
I guess you didn't see it. Well, maybe you wouldn't recognize him. He was there as a guest of Catherine Austin Fitts. She had invited Chris Carter to come because he was working at the time on this mini series about Area 51 that I don't think was ever produced, ever got on the air. It was for Sci-Fi, I think. But he used a lot of the information that he had heard at the Secret Space Conference, whatever it was called. A lot of that information was folded into those 2 revival seasons. You know, stuff with like Secret Space Program and off-worlding and all these kind of things. So it's very much taken directly from that. But anyway, the point being is that this Kyle Odom thing happened I think like a week afterwards. But that thing where, you know, that plot line where he right? We can't even tell the difference anymore, right? Where he hops the White House fence and he's throwing his manifesto. That's directly from an episode of the X-Files called 3 Words, where this guy who's part of the sort of abductee cult hops the White House fence with his manifesto to warn the president that people are being taken over by aliens. So there are actually several different X-Files plot lines, and I spell them out in the book. That, like, was Kyle Odom just like a really hardcore X-Files fan, and that kind of inspired this whole thing? You know, I mean, obviously the thing with aliens possessing human bodies and so on, that's like the whole thing with the black oil and the super soldiers and everything. So that was a really interesting timing. I was really fixated on that story when that happened. But the fact that it's this kind of weird loner, the connections to religion and politics, it all did strike me as being not directly connected, but certainly thematically similar.
Yeah.
To the Charlie Kirk thing.
I'm just glad you reminded me of it because it is such a wild story. Then, you know, we have so many random brain scrambled nuts out there with weapons that it's sometimes hard to remember who did what. But, you know, you throw in the alien stuff and the manifesto and you're really cooking here.
Well, the thing is what Kyle Odom said that I think is kind of a good point is that, you know, he shot this guy 6 times square in the body mass with a .45. That's a lot of punishment for a human body to take. Odom had said, see, that proves that he's an alien. You know, how could he have survived that? But that's another plot line in the X-Files, is that aliens can't be killed through just, you know, aliens in human form can't be killed through simple gunshots. You either have to hit like a particular area of their body or use some sort of special weapon. So that was really freaky. And that was not the only time that people sort of manifested themselves from X-Files stories onto quote unquote real world, because we had Max Spears coughing up the black oil before he died. Gary McKinnon, whose whole story, you know, the UFO hacker who broke into the Pentagon and found out all these files of off-world projects and off-world missions. And that's straight from the X-Files too. That's straight from the episode Anasazi. It seems that like reality, such as it is, sort of flits in and out. But that's what happens. You know, this is the thing that I've been telling you and I've been telling people for a long time, is that when you start playing with all these kind of themes and all these symbols and stuff, like things happen, you know, things happen that break that veil between our reality and fictional reality, or, you know, internal reality. That veil gets pierced and strange things start to happen. So
yes. And the Max Spears thing, for people who don't remember him, he was a UFO investigator. I had to be reminded by, you know, reading the book, but he spit up some black goo material, and then he texted his mom, if something happens to me, investigate. And that's all I really know.
Well, he's somebody who I'd followed. That was like the old days, like the Project Camelot days, like just
the glory days.
Yeah, it kind of was the glory days. You know, this is when everybody had like embedded video before everybody was just going to YouTube and so on. That whole UFO counterculture that I would argue that Tom DeLonge killed, you know, because that whole culture was really heating up, particularly in 2016. And then, you know, the following year, he and Podesta come out with this whole to the stars and A-tip and all this kind of, I mean, you know my opinion on that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But that, to me, I think that killed the UFO conspiracy counterculture. I don't think it ever recovered from that, because that's the ultimate buzzkill, right? The government admits it, but it's a really lame admittance, you know, their
Right.
admission, right?
Exactly. I mean, I tried to drill that into Stephen Bassett's head, and it just wasn't working all that well. But you mentioned that people are maybe watching the X-Files wrong, and you want them to watch it right. What is right to you? What are they missing when they remember X-Files or revisit X-Files that you just wish that they would get?
Well, there are a lot of things, but, you know, one of the things that I wrote about in my Ultimate Fan Theory is how often stories about aliens and ancient astronauts and all the rest of it are twinned with episodes about mushrooms, LSD, hallucinogenic drugs. Hallucinogenic drugs, particularly mushrooms, are a constant through line throughout the entire series. You know, this is my theory, right? And I'm sure the people writing these stories would either disagree and not admit that they agree, right? But if you really start to look at things like, particularly like the black oil, I mean, the black oil is basically a hallucinogenic drug that takes people over, you know, possesses them and turns them into basically alien demons. But you see that throughout the entire series. And the thing that really blew my mind, and I kind of felt like Chris Carter wrote this episode to me, in season 10, there was this episode called Babylon. And it was all about like taking mushrooms to go, you know, the descent to the underworld, like straight out of the mystery religions. And they had Smoking Man playing Chiron. And I mean, the whole thing was just everything that I've been talking about as far as like the connection between aliens and hallucinogenic drugs and all the rest of it that I had picked up on throughout the entire series. And I think most fans didn't, because I don't think most fans had experience with hallucinogens, so they wouldn't know what to look for. But I mean, here's my favorite example, though, that I think is almost like the argument in it. There was an episode they did called Field Trip, right? Already from the title, you get the inference there. But it's about, you know, the Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina. So they go to investigate, but they don't realize that this is giant man-eating hallucinogenic mushroom colony underground that like drugs people, lures them in, and then consumes them, like digests them as they're having these trips. The episode right after that was about these quote unquote alien tablets that a Dr. Sandoz had discovered. You know, Sandoz being the pharmaceutical company in Switzerland that had basically invented LSD in the first place. You know what I mean? So this is what I'm talking about, the twinning. They have this whole episode where basically Mulder and Scully are having this 45-minute long mushroom trip, you know, that we see, that, you know, the aliens are coming and Mulder captures an alien and all these kind of things. And the next episode, like Mulder is affected by these quote unquote tablets that a Dr. Sandoz, you know, was in possession of. So it's just like, come on, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like when you do that back to back, and it's like, that's like really obvious, but you'll see this throughout. Now, Chris Carter was like a surfer in the 70s in California. I mean, that dude probably dropped a lot of acid, you know what I'm saying? And here's an interesting thing as well, is that I think it was in between the first and second seasons. No, I'm sorry, the second and third season. He had gone to Sedona at the invitation of some Navajo and took part in a peyote ritual. You know, and he was very upfront about it. He didn't try to, you know, disguise it. And then that was written into the third season opener. This whole thing, they didn't have the mushrooms, you know, or the peyote buttons explicitly in that episode. But that's clearly what it's riffing on. That's the first thing you really have to notice, is that first of all, it's never really clear if there actually are aliens. You know what I mean? If we see aliens from time to time, but not as much as you might think. But we're never really sure if, you know, this is the unreliable narrator. What we do see explicitly is mushrooms, LSD, peyote, you know,
Right.
I mean, all this kind of stuff. So I said in the book, and I've always said, that I think this series is about hallucinogens just as much as that it's about conspiracies or aliens.
Yeah, it's interesting to make that connection because obviously disclosure and this traditional ETH narrative is so aggressive within the community, like forced on it. But yet, we see these other layers, like maybe they aren't from space. Maybe they're just from a different dimension. Maybe it's the same. The psychedelics are the same type of trigger to facilitate an experience. And then, yeah, a lot of people, when they think back to the X-Files, they just think of it as a UFO traditional alien show. And you're saying, no, actually, a lot of this stuff is peppered in there. And a thing to me that is interesting, having grown up in the 90s, having seen this in the zeitgeist, even though I was young and watched it later when it was maybe a little past its prime, it just is so interesting to me that a show like this would be the primetime thing, the water cooler talk the next day. I am nostalgic for the glue of those kind of cultural shows where now it's like you have to ask someone, are you watching this or this or this? Because who knows what people are watching? There's nothing connecting us, not since maybe Game of Thrones. So I like that idea. And then also just the trust level of people. I don't know if they put a show like this on the air because the internet was so new that you couldn't look this stuff up and then make these connections. But if a show like this was on the air today, I don't know if we would be sucked into that government trust that everybody has that really made COVID possible. Like, it seems like the people in the 90s were way more willing to be like, yeah, the government probably is involved in some shit like this.
Well, you got to realize that this is following on Iran-Contra, all these things like Ruby Ridge and Waco. Waco was about 6 months before the X-Files premiered. There was a lot, there was the rise of the militia movement, George Bush's speech about the New World Order, the Gulf War sickness, which the X-Files referenced several times, talked about Gulf War illness. So I think that it was in the air, and there were also like UFOs and abduction and all these kind of things were very much in the culture, particularly following Whitley Strieber's Communion. I mean, people don't remember that was a bestseller. I was working in New York when that book came out, and you could not pass Barnes & Noble or B. Dalton or Walden Books or, all these chains that most of them don't exist anymore, but you couldn't pass a bookstore without seeing a big display with like several copies of Communion in the window. That book was huge. He did all the sequels, and then there are all these people who sort of try to steal his thunder. But this was also following on the whole thing with Bob Lazar and Area 51. Again, tons of references to Area 51 and all the rest of it, reverse engineering from the very earliest episodes in the X-Files. So they're really picking up on the zeitgeist. So there was this kind of, I don't want to say skepticism or distrust or whatever, but there was definitely a lot of this kind of stuff in the air, conspiracies. And this is a couple years after Behold a Pale Horse was released. You had books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. There was so much of this kind of stuff in the mainstream. And this is hot on the heels of Graham Hancock and Fingerprints of the Gods, so all the stuff with alternative history, alternative archaeology, but also the ancient astronaut stuff became really big again when, like, all of a sudden Zechariah Sitchin's in everywhere you look. And there was also a show that was on just before the X-Files premiered. It was a show called Sightings, and it was sort of like a paranormal news show. And it was hosted by a guy named Timothy White, who was a retired Air Force general. There's a lot of this stuff in the air. There were UFO conventions. I mean, UFO conventions were a big thing in the 90s. And actually, that guy, George Knapp, actually did a documentary on how big UFO conventions were. I mean, there was like one somewhere in the United States every weekend back then. So this was all very much in the air.
Yeah, and you mentioned Gary McKinnon and that plot line for an episode, Anasazi, season 2, episode 25. I actually had notes about this episode of all the ones, but the plot line is a hacker breaks into Pentagon files, revealing the truth about UFOs. The files are encrypted in Navajo, leading Mulder and Scully to New Mexico. And that, is a tie-in with the Chris Carter Navajo peyote ritual. But while we're talking about ufology a little bit, yeah, obviously there was a lot happening at the time, but one thing that I keep coming back to, really the reason I had Stephen Bassett on, is this photograph. It's also mentioned in the book, at least the conferences, but this photograph of the Lawrence Rockefeller retreat that has all the big names in ufology there. Linda Moulton Howe, Stephen Greer, even Bob Bigelow. Like, I don't know. I just think multi-billionaires and 100 millionaires got better things to do than hang out with Stephen Greer. When I keep bringing this photo up, I've shown it to, Richard Dolan and Stephen Bassett, and neither one of them has the same visceral kind of skepticism about what this is as I do. And when you put it in the context of the X-Files, this was September 14th and 15th of 1993, the very weekend after they launched the X-Files pilot on primetime TV. The damn show comes out September 10th, and then the following weekend, Linda Moulton Howe, Stephen Greer, Bob Bigelow, about a dozen other people are meeting at Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch. I don't know. I mean, what do you think what does this mean to you? Is this the seeding of the op? Is this the meetings of the minds to structure how they're going to control and frame high strangeness for the next decade and a half?
That could be part of it, but remember who Lawrence Rockefeller was. I mean, Lawrence Rockefeller gave the seed money for Esalen. He gave the seed money for the Noetic Sciences Institute. He gave the seed money for the California Institute of Integral Studies. He was basically building sort of a new age empire at that time. He was funding a lot of ufology. He was funding people like Roger Lear, I believe. A lot of big name ufologists were actually getting on his payroll. And that's something that people don't remember. This is something that we discussed when we talked about He Will Live Up in the Sky. I think one big mistake that a lot of and maybe I shouldn't use the term, but sort of amateur conspiracists make is that they make the mistakes that these people involved in this stuff can't be true believers. They can't actually believe in this stuff. That is mistake number one. You have to realize that people who get into this stuff believe it. And I think Lawrence Rockefeller was involved in this because he was trying to build, it was part of his new age religion empire. I think that's more like it, but I think he was a big believer in it. There's that famous photo where he's walking with Hillary Clinton and she's carrying like some sort of UFO book that he gave her. I think he was genuinely into it, to be honest with you. And I think that Greer has talked about this. I mean, Greer talked about how Rockefeller was a true believer in this phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I'm only saying, and I think it's a current that goes through all of our interviews, they definitely believe something, but it's not always presented to us in the same context of what they actually believe. So basics of it, the 101 is that I think they're trying to promote occultism, which you can't just come right out and promote, but you can do a bunch of university studies on psychedelics. You can seed the culture with UFOs and space aliens because it just doesn't have the same religious residue, even though it really probably is a more religious type of thing.
I don't know if we talked about this, but the ufology has always been a top-down phenomenon. Ufology, as we know it, was basically the creation of a bunch of Navy admirals back in the late 40s.
Yeah, one with your name.
Yes. So, but if you also look at NICAP, which was like the big UFO investigation project for a number of years, the board of directors were all retired military, mostly from the Navy or the Marines. This is something that was kind of an aha moment. And I have the article somewhere, but somebody's it was in some left-wing magazine, it might have been Mother Jones of the Nation or something, who was writing about how the whole UFO thing was really the creation of these admirals. And they've been sustaining it. And if you look at what's going on today with this whole disclosure movement, I mean, look at people like Grush and Fravor and Elizondo and Semivan and Mellon. I mean, these are all very high-placed people in the military industrial complex establishment, all of them. And that is kind of why I don't really pay too much attention to it, because what is their agenda? So I think there's always been an agenda, and there remains an agenda to create a UFO religion. I think that absolutely is probably what Rockefeller wanted to really do. I don't think he was running an op. I think he was trying to start a religion, to be honest with you.
Fair. So let me read to you a random post I found on Reddit from a guy who goes by Jesse James. He says, X-Files is a favorite show of mine of all time. I think someone high up allowed the X-Files to be released. If you look at the evidence in the way the average person thought about UFOs/government conspiracy when the show aired, as compared to now, it's 180 degrees different. Who was talking about Project Paperclip in 1995? Let's go one step further. Who was talking about Unit 731 and the Japanese Biological Weapons Project in 1995? Nobody. There's a guy named Chris Knowles who wrote a book on the show years ago. He was buddies with Frank Spotsnitz and had a behind-the-curtain look at the show, and someone definitely wanted the show to stay on the air. The ratings were pretty bad the first 2 seasons, but the show was never canceled. There's way too much I could write here, but I'll point you towards Bruce Rux's Hollywood vs. the Aliens. It's all about slowly bringing the public along and not scaring the hell out of them along the way. We've come a long way from little green men and flying saucers. So I like that. It's nice to see you penetrating the zeitgeist like that, to see a Chris Knowles reference in the wild unexpectedly. But would you agree with that comment? Did the show seem to be engineered to reveal, with help, staying on the air despite low ratings early on?
You have to remember that at that time, Fox was still a fairly new network. They didn't really have a lot to put on the air. They weren't even airing a full week of programming at that time. The X-Files was just basically like a sacrificial lamb at the time, because they thought the big show was going to be the show called The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr. starring Bruce Campbell.
Yeah.
So the whole idea was like, that was going to be the draw. That was going to be the big hit. That was going to be the show that brought people in. The X-Files was just basically going to be there to set it up. You know, it's like sort of like the support band at a concert. Like they were just basically going to be the opening act for this Briscoe County. Now, Briscoe County just died on the vine. I think what really saved the X-Files was they realized, because of the rise of the internet, it was all still dial-up back then, but they realized that the show was appealing to what they call the demographic. And the demographic being like 18 to 49 people with a lot of disposable income. At least they did back then. But as far as UFOs go, I mean, most of the episodes in the entire series, but particularly in those first seasons, were not about UFOs. I think there might have been like 6 out of 25 episodes in the first season were about UFOs. It was more like horror and sci-fi, because what they call the monsters of the week, were much more the meat and potatoes of the show. You know, because Chris Carter was really inspired by Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was way before your time. It was a show that I watched when I was very, very young, when I could get away with it because my parents didn't let me watch it. But I don't know particularly if it would have been part of agenda, because also it was depicting aliens as being rather sinister and hostile. I mean, it wasn't part of this agenda that you saw in films like E.T., Close Encounters, Taken, a lot of movies. There was a lot of other movies in the 80s that, you know, aliens were our friends and they were just basically these cute little visitors and so on. I mean, there's a lot of pedo nonsense undercurrent flowing through all those kind of stories. But from the very, very start, from the pilot episode, aliens are bad. The people who corroborate or collaborate with the aliens are bad. They're evil, you know, they're demons. They're here to harm us. They're doing experiments on us. I mean, this is not the kind of message that somebody like Lawrence Rockefeller would necessarily want to let slip. And one thing that I would also remind you, in the midst of all this UFO hysteria, or whatever you want to call it, in the 90s, you started people like Bill Cooper started to come around. He had been putting out the most ridiculous UFO nonsense out there, but he started to wake up. Carla Turner, who had written a couple of books on UFO abduction, was starting to think that we're really looking at my labs. Jim Keith did so as well in Saucers of the Illuminati. And what do those 3 people have in common, Greg?
They're what? No, what?
They're all dead.
Well, I was going to say that, but I wasn't sure about I know Jim Keith, obviously, and Bill Cooper.
In the expanded hardcover, I basically list a lot of these people who were involved in ufology who came to unnatural early ends.
Yeah.
Which is also very curious to me. And this is something that I've paid attention to for a long time. And, you know, we talked about Max Spears, right? It's a very complicated issue. And I think it tends to get simplified by people who maybe have some other agenda. But again, when you look at those stories, it's very difficult to argue that the X-Files was part of some agenda to acclimate people to aliens and alien religion, some sort of childhood's end scenario where the aliens are our friends, but we have to, they look like devils, so we have to wait 50 years
Right.
until they reveal themselves.
I read that recently. It holds up, and it was basically a recommendation of yours. Well, yeah, obviously the tone is different, and the orientation, the good bad orientation of the beings in the show is different. But if you're trying to say that they're trying to take high strangeness things in general, which are more of a multidimensional phenomenon, and cast it out into space in people's minds, I guess it could kind of fit. But I hear what you're saying. So we have talked about Stranger Things before, and how that first season reveals so much about MK Ultra. You could say that, like, they're giving you what really was going on with MK Ultra and MK Often, and then they're saying, but it wasn't so bad for her because she got superpowers and now she's great. When really it's torture of a child. We talked about how it seems like the Duffer Brothers likely had some assistance in writing out those details because it maybe was a limited hangout, or for some reason somebody wanted to popularize the MK Ultra program. Do you see anything like that happening? I mean, because as you say, the show is about much more than just aliens. There's the syndicate, there's the biolabs. Was there someone connected kind of helping with the show? Because you do have some quotes where, I guess in one of the DVD commentaries, someone says that FBI agents had told them that it wasn't all that far off. Things on the show aren't all that far off from the truth. And that
CIA agents,
and CIA agents would go to parties in Hollywood and give Chris Carter ideas. So, I mean, we're talking about exactly what I'm saying.
Well, my theory on Stranger Things is that I don't think it's the same thing with the X-Files. People had very low expectations. And this whole idea that, the Illuminati are micromanaging everything that goes on the air just doesn't really hold water. I think that Stranger Things was sort of a dark horse, right? They weren't expecting it. And I don't think when you watch the advertisements or the previews or whatever before it came on, all the MK Ultra stuff wasn't really referenced. It was more about like the sort of Spielbergian 80s fantasy movie with kids and so on. I think what happened with Stranger Things is that after that first season aired, some people approached those guys and said, all right, listen, this isn't going to fly. We're not doing this anymore. You know what I mean? It's like, no, this is a little too much. And that's why the very next season, like all of a sudden, you had the Paul Reiser character who's like the nice MK Ultra guy.
Right. They spun it off in a weird direction from where it started.
It's amazing to me when I rewatch the first season, which I do periodic basis, let's just say, how different it is and how much heavier it is and how more similar it is to a lot of early 80s, movies from 1983 that seem to be telling tales out of school. I'm thinking of Wavelength and Brainstorm and maybe even War Games. I mean, there were a number of movies that took a very jaundiced look at the military establishment, military intelligence, military industrial, all these different various power structures that you didn't see by the end of the 80s. It was something, it wasn't cool. And it might have almost been like a leftover from the 70s, because you saw a lot of films in the 70s that were very conspiratorial, that were very skeptical of state power and so on. And then that kind of just evaporates by the end of the 70s. I'm sorry, the end of the 80s. By and large, the X-Files is really a show about monsters and the paranormal. People think of it as a UFO show, but as I said, the UFO episodes are very much the minority in every single season. Every single season. I guess you could maybe argue in season 10, that little mini series, that you have 3 of the episodes that are oriented towards UFOs and stuff. So maybe that's a little different. But, the full seasons, and a lot of fans don't like those, what they call the mythology. Then they find those stories too hard to follow. And I was the same way. I was the same way back when the show was on the air. When these, what I called them conspiracy episodes, I'd be just like, oh, let me get out my charts and graphs and my flow chart and see who's this guy, what's going on here. It's like, it just got to be like homework.
Right.
It just was too much to follow. And it wasn't until I started watching those episodes in order, without all the, stories about werewolves and vampires and all the rest of it, that I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. This is like, it's this incredible novel that just spreads out over the seasons. There are two things that I want to address here. You can watch that show, the entire series, and think there are no actual aliens, because there are all these references throughout the show that this is all being staged, this is all a hoax, this is all some sort of psyop, and that the aliens, when we see them, it's like we get these little fleeting glimpses. So, are they seeing something because they expect to be seeing something? We do see UFOs, but we know from the very first actual episode past the pilot that the government is making UFOs. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
At an Air Force base based on Area 51. So you can watch that series and think, well, all this stuff about aliens isn't really about aliens. It's really about the government experimenting on human beings, psychologically, with drugs, with technology, and all the rest of it.
Yes, actually, that's a great point. I actually wanted to talk about the unethical human experimentation examples you have in the book, but I wanted to throw this out while we're kind of equating Stranger Things and X-Files and real reveals. So most people listening will know about the Lone Gunmen 9/11 sync. So the Lone Gunmen was a spinoff that came on after X-Files had wrapped. And I'm going to play it in the final version of this real quick. It's only a couple minutes. This is the pilot episode of the X-Files spinoff. It aired 6 months before 9/11.
What the hell are you doing? Why can't you stay out of this? Leave me buried.
What is Scenario 12D? We know it's a war game scenario, that it has to do with airline counterterrorism. Why is that important enough to kill for?
Because it's no longer a game.
But if some terrorist group wants to act out this scenario, why target you for assassination?
Depends on who your terrorists are.
The men who conceived of it in the first place. You're saying our government plans to commit a terrorist act against a domestic airline?
There you go. Indicting the entire government as usual. It's a faction. A small faction.
For what possible gain?
The Cold War's over, John. But with no clear enemy to stockpile against, the arms market's flat. But bring down a fully loaded 727 into the middle of New York City, and you'll find a dozen tin pot dictators all over the world just clamoring to take responsibility and begging to be smart-bombed.
I can't believe it. This is about increasing arms sales.
Mm-hmm.
When?
Tonight?
How are you going to stop them? Why didn't you tell the world this? Go to the press.
You think I'd still be drawing breath 30 minutes after I made that call? The press? Who's going to run this story?
We would.
This? This is birdcage liner. Wild-eyed crap right up there with Elvis as an alien and two-headed babies.
You obviously read it.
Don't be so damn naive. You think this is going to save the world? I'm doing what I can, John. I don't have all the specifics on Scenario 12D, but I think I know the flight they've chosen. You stay out of it. I don't want Overlord gunning for you, too.
Find anything?
The luggage hold's clear if this thing can be trusted. What'd you do, make it with your erector set?
You're absolutely sure that this is the targeted flight?
This flight was chosen primarily for its visibility. It's scheduled to pass over Manhattan on its way to Boston.
You said they intend to bring us down in the middle of New York City? What if there is no bomb?
Well, how are they going to bring it down?
The same way a dead man can drive a car.
What do you mean, no bomb?
Langley, I need you to hack into the aircraft's onboard navigation system. We need to know where we're headed.
Okay, go into headsets. I'll clone the airphone's carrier. Make them think we're sending a ground air fax.
That's one twisted Star 69.
I'll just get ready to ride the wave, hippie boy.
Just get me on that plane and I'll get you autopilot access.
How are you going to do that?
Airline telemetry systems use processors similar to those found in CB radios.
I'm in. We got ourselves a convoy.
What's your progress?
I've hacked into the flight control system output.
With a little bit of help.
It's what the brains of the plane is telling the little black box.
Course, heading, attitude, hold, yaw, axis, stabilization. What the heck's that?
Is that what it looks like?
I think it is what it looks like.
What does what look like?
Modem protocols. Remote access. Somebody on the ground's flying your plane.
Bogey, sir.
Keep your course. I need to know our flight plan.
I'm mapping the data now.
Byers, your flight's gonna make an unscheduled stop in exactly 22 minutes.
Corner of Liberty and Washington. Lower Manhattan.
World Trade Center. I'm going to crash the plane into the World Trade Center.
All right, try cutting electrical power.
Thought of that. They've thought of everything.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties up here. At this time, we'd like you all to return to your seats.
And kiss your asses goodbye.
Finally, we're getting close.
I know.
Damn it! New York Center, this is Atlantic National Flight 265 Heavy. We are declaring an emergency. We have 110 souls on board, 16,000 pounds of fuel.
That is so wild, and it is interesting that remote controlled is even mentioned, which is what a lot of people seem to think about the real event, if there were any planes at all, as they're saying now. But they even say in there, it's not the government. It's a cabal of people with a secret agenda using the government. There's just so many little layers to what is said in that dialogue, as you know, that it's like, wow, what a hit. I don't know if there's other things you can think of from the main show X-Files that have that kind of like foreshadowing potency to real events. I'm sure there's a couple, but you did have something to say about that lone gunman clip and how you think it emerged to have been possible to have been in the show and aired so soon before the real event.
Yeah, one of the problems that I have with people who make opinions about that is that they've never actually watched the episode. And if you actually watch the episode, this is all being staged. It's this program called Overlord by this cabal within the government, basically the neocons, pretty much, and to start wars and ramp up arms sales, which is exactly what happened following 9/11, isn't it? Now, if this was all some sort of predictive programming or whatever, that wouldn't fly. They wouldn't let that go. You know, I mean, the government, the CIA, I mean, we know for a fact, I mean, this has been documented over and over again, that the military and the CIA were all up in Hollywood's grill for years and just basically dictating terms, you know, just basically say, if you don't write the stories that we want you to write, you're not going to get any of our cooperation and our money and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
So that is not a story. When you actually watch the actual episode, that's not a story that anyone in the government or the Pentagon or whomever, anybody in a position of authority, it could well be somebody was feeding them information and saying, you know, something's coming, something's going to happen, and we want this out there so people can reference back to it, you know what I mean, and maybe wake up, you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's just a theory on my part. You know, it jibes with all the things that have just fallen down the memory hole that people like Bill Cooper, right, was warning that something of this scale was going to happen and it was going to be blamed on bin Laden well before it happened. There are all these kind of stories that summer of warnings that there were some sort of plot to fly planes into skyscrapers and so on. I mean, this is all being talked about in the media well before 9/11, and it all just got flushed down the memory hole. But as I detail in the book, there were plots to fly airplanes into buildings going back to the 70s. This was something that was always in the air, and I think it kind of started when I think it was a B-29 flew into the Empire State Building, I think in 45, like somewhere in the 40s. There was a heavy fog and this plane just like crashed into the Empire State Building.
Yet it's still there.
Yeah, well, there's all these. Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know my thoughts on 9/11. You know what that was really about. But that's too much to go into here.
Right.
But I think yeah, I think a much more sensible theory that I think is better supported by the facts and evidence is that if it wasn't just some weird coincidence, which things do happen. You know, I talked about Jack Kirby drew a story about somebody flying a jet that was loaded with like nuclear devices into a skyscraper. You know, that was in 1984. But, you know, Kirby also did like The Face on Mars in 1957. You know, Kirby was just like on a different level. If it wasn't just like some just weird fluke, which I have trouble believing it was, I think that because there were so many people who had dissented from that whole neocon Gulf War II agenda and so on, since Carter did have these connections with people like in the FBI, mostly in the FBI as far as what I've heard, what better way to sort of at least put your marker down than a very high profile show airing on on a Sunday night after The Simpsons and so on. I mean, that is just speculation on my part, but I think that a lot of the theories that people espouse about that episode, they just don't hold water. They're not, because it's so clear that the people, espousing these theories never actually watched the episode.
Fair enough. I mean, with 13 seasons and a couple of movies and all the conspiracy tropes peppered throughout the X-Files, are there any similar scenes that stand out as predating a real event that is like a pretty big nail on the head like that one was?
I don't know that, that's hard to beat.
It is.
You can't really overshadow that one. There were a lot of episodes with storylines that, we've kind of taken for granted these days. Just for an example, there's an episode called Herrenvolk, which is how the smallpox vaccination was used to collect genetic information that was being used to tag and catalog us. And that's something that, we've heard talked about. All the storylines with vaccination and engineered plagues go back, way back in the series, at least to the second season, if not before, by inference. They did an episode on called Red Museum, where cattle were being injected with alien DNA. So this whole idea that our food supplies are being used for delivery for genetic experimentation, which I think Bill Gates was talking about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right. You know what I'm saying? I mentioned Deep Throat, where UFOs are being used as cover for experimental aircraft, right? There's an episode called the Pine Bluff variant, where far-right militias are all under government control and used for terror purposes. And in this particular case, it's to test this really horrific toxin, biological warfare kind of thing. My Struggle 2, I think you might have mentioned this, where the pandemic is being used as a cover for genetic manipulation via CRISPR-Cas9. I mean, who knew about CRISPR-Cas9 in 2016?
Right, exactly.
Those are just some of the ones that come to my mind off the top of my head. This is a really big one, because in the expanded hardcover version, I did a chapter on Edward Snowden. Well, they were doing exactly what Snowden was talking about several years before he came out of the woodwork. There's an episode called Trust No One, which is all about, like, specifically about the NSA doing, basically collecting surveillance on everyone. And who knew about that? Who was talking about the NSA and broad spectrum surveillance in 2002?
Right. Not many.
It's funny because, like, after 9/11, it's like it almost seemed like the stories got more extreme, because you had a lot of storylines that were much more confrontational, I guess you would say, and Trust No One is a perfect example of that. But that was like really gutsy when they're talking about the Patriot Act to do an entire storyline about the NSA just basically hoovering up all our data everywhere and having everyone under surveillance.
Right.
Who was talking about back then?
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a big one. Okay, so before this interview ends, I did want to at least touch on Anne Heche because you did a really great deep dive on this, and then you did a presentation on tinfoil hats, 2.5 hours. Anybody who's interested in really the long form of this should really check out that tinfoil hat interview. But that footage of Anne Heche being put in the ambulance, rising up after her fiery car crash, it definitely disturbed me. And I will play it as we're talking about it. But I didn't really know much about Anne Heche, except I've heard the name a couple of times. And I don't know why I didn't look more into it, but it just seemed like one weird event in a continuum of weird events. It's probably more relevant with some of these facts. So if people don't know, she did date Ellen from 1997 to 2000, being in the first openly lesbian couple in Hollywood. The premise of the overall material that you did, I would say, is that she probably knew a little bit too much about the dark network of Hollywood. Ellen, of course, wears that white bloody face hoodie along with Diddy. Why Diddy and Ellen are wearing any similar wardrobe, I don't understand.
Don't forget the set that looks like Jeffrey Epstein's temple, too.
Absolutely. We'll throw that up there. If people haven't seen Ellen's set, it does look quite a bit like that strange temple. Diddy was also on the show sometimes, which was weird, but Diddy was formally charged in 2024, the year Ellen moved to the UK. And funny, rumors seem to be that Tom Hanks moved to Greece in 2024 too. I hear he bounces back and forth, but that's another person associated with the bloody face image via the Wilson Castaway Volleyball. Anyway, in 2001, Anne Heche published a memoir titled Call Me Crazy, in which she alleged extensive sexual abuse by her father. Seems like she wanted to talk about such things. Also, the film she had just completed before her death is The Girl in Room 13. Apparently it sucks, but this is the plot. Grace becomes addicted to opioids after suffering a sports injury. She's ready to leave her addiction behind under her mother's watch, but her past won't let her go. Richie kidnaps her in a motel room to sell her into human trafficking. Probably would have been a hell of a press tour if Anne Heche was around to have it. Her crash in 2022, the same year Ellen's DJ Twitch was found in a hotel room dead of suicide. Autopsy report showed no drugs or alcohol in his system, and the wife filed a missing persons report the day before. Family says he was in no way depressed. Sketchy. The ring camera footage of the crash looks like she couldn't stop. Maybe the brakes were cut. They didn't get her out of the fiery car for over 49 minutes, which you've said is a detail to pay attention to. You wrote that this is one of the most unsettling cases you've ever investigated, and I have a feeling there's a lot more disturbing on the bone. There is something seriously wrong with what's going on here, you say. So I just kind of want to ask you to give us the brief overview, but I do think when you add up all these facts, it does seem like a cleanup of people who might have known about the dark stuff at the Diddy parties or the Frazzle drip video or something, but two people around Ellen who know her intimately, dead in the same year, and then she leaves the country.
Ellen was tied in with a lot of people. Well, first of all, Ellen, her first girlfriend in 1980 died in a car crash as well. Apparently, this woman was tied up with, this is in New Orleans, she's tied up with organized crime and so on. 3 years later, Anne Heche's brother dies in a car crash. And Anne Heche later said that she thought it was suicide. Her father died of AIDS that same year. And that's like really early. That's 2 years before the whole Rock Hudson thing hit the news and so on. You talked about the whole Frazzle drift thing. We both have seen something. Actually, the thing I saw was a little, it was a little bit nebulous. I'm not exactly sure what I was looking at. But another person you didn't mention was Justin Roiland of Rick and Morty fame, because he started off doing this cartoon that was basically this weird pedophile monster who liked to, basically frazzle drip kids, like just rip their faces off.
Yep, I found that too.
A lot of people might not remember that a few years ago, before he was canceled, basically, he did an ad for Pringles where he basically, they redid that, like they redid the Frazzledrip thing, but when they tore the face off, there was like an android face underneath. It was, it was Morty's face underneath it. Or is it Rick? I don't remember.
I heard you say that, and I couldn't find that one. I saw a Wendy's commercial he made.
Yeah, I think they might have memory holed it because I think people might have said, "What are you doing here? This is really sick and weird."
Right. You revealed it on the Super Bowl, basically, and then you got hit with a sex scandal and your career was ruined. Funny how that worked out.
Heche was, as you said, with Ellen, and there's been a lot of talk that maybe Ellen was involved, and I don't really believe that. I think it's very possible, if not likely, that Heche was killed to send a message to Ellen, because Ellen, don't forget, her show had been canceled just a few weeks before Heche dies in that accident. Was she planning on talking? She had nothing to lose. She basically said that they destroyed her career. And if you look at the way that all played out, it was so clearly orchestrated. It was so clearly one of these operations that was run out of these big agencies in Hollywood when they want to get rid of people who are basically not producing what as far as income, what they need them to produce. And that's why, we had Me Too and all the rest of it. Look at the people who were taken up by Me Too. It was people who had once made a lot of money for a lot of people and then lost a lot of money for a lot of people. Harvey Weinstein being a classic example. That guy made a lot of money in the 90s. Then he starts the Weinstein Company. And I don't think any of those films that they released made any money. So how do you get rid of him? Because, here's a guy who's got a lot of dirt on a lot of people, everybody's in each other's business. So my working theory is that because the Diddy thing was heating up behind the scenes, as you mentioned, what was her name? Destiny, I think. Who was her name? The woman who brought the charges.
Cassie.
Okay, Cassie. So that's really what opens up the whole floodgates. But that story was boiling under for several years, for at least 5 years before that, because I'd mentioned how Cat Williams had been talking about Diddy and the white parties and all this stuff for ages. And there's always been talk that Diddy might have had Tupac killed and all these kind of things. Luckily for Diddy, they put in James Comey's daughter to prosecute that case, and she just totally mishandled everything. And
right.
All these people who I think would have been exposed by whatever tapes, whatever evidence Diddy might have been collecting to blackmail them, which we now know that he was doing, it was going to create a lot of problems for a lot of people. And I think it was going to end up going very high up. And one of the people that Diddy was associated with was Clive Davis. And if you don't know that name, that dude is like, basically one of the emperors of the music industry. He started Arista Records and had a ton of major artists, Whitney Houston being one of them, who's now also no longer with us. Things got very dark and bad at some point in the music industry. And maybe like the money evaporating because of Napster and downloading it, maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. I think there were a lot of people concerned. And again, this is just a working theory, that because Ellen was so tight with Diddy, that she knew a lot of things that he knew. But you can't kill Ellen.
Why?
Because she's too high profile. And I'm sure she probably had dead man switches and things filed away.
I'm sure once you get into a certain level, they all kind of tell each other, hey, if you see this now, I'm going to show you something here now. And we're going to have to, put your name on the thumb drive that we got back there in the safe so that people know that you have this too. There probably is like that conversation. Like if you go past this threshold, then, you need insurance.
I think that's exactly correct. You recently had John McAfee's widow on.
Yeah.
And, we know all about those stories with dead man switches and so on. So I think killing Ellen would be extremely problematic. People don't remember that she was also in a car accident. She had T-boned somebody at an intersection, and maybe that was an attempt. I don't know. When you look at the timeline and you look at some of the evidence, Anne had gone into a boutique or some sort of salon or something and bought a wig. And, the guy who owned the salon said she was, perfectly normal, perfectly happy, didn't seem stressed or anything like that. Didn't seem like she was high or drunk, it just seemed like just very happy and normal. And then all of a sudden she's cruising down a side street in Santa Monica at 100 miles an hour. I think her car was commandeered by remote control. I think when she had that little accident, when she hit some garage in some crappy apartment building and then drove off, I think she was starting to panic, and then she almost hits a woman. I think she gets into another thing. I think she had lost control of her vehicle and she didn't know what was going on. But I think by the time she's barreling down that street at 100 miles an hour and you hear this like screeching sound, which to me sounds like she was trying to engage her parking brake, which, as you know, if you're going 100 miles an hour, isn't going to do shit, right? I think that she knew by then that, that somebody was trying to kill her. And the fact that she was allowed to sit in that car, that burning car in a burning house for 49 minutes is just, I can't even wrap my head around that.
It's a long time. That's 2 episodes of Seinfeld.
Particularly since, the fire department was already, on the scene fairly quickly, but somehow there were no paramedics there. There was just one of these kind of fire ambulances, but there was no paramedic team. There was just a couple of firefighters who just basically tossed her into the back of this truck. The way she was strapped in, they said that she had like a neck injury or something. Well, then why did they put basically a seatbelt across her neck? They said that she was having oxygen-starved brain. Well, why wasn't she unconscious? They said that she was severely burned, she had severe injuries, but if you look at the autopsy reports, she basically had patches of secondary burns. She was very, very lucky. Despite the fact that they let her sit in that car for 49 minutes, she only had fairly small areas of burn, and they were second-degree burns. They weren't even like third-degree burns. None of it adds up. At one point, they say she's doing fine, and Thomas Jane, who was her ex-boyfriend, comes and said, oh, she's going to make it, and she's going to recover, and she's in stable condition. Then all of a sudden, we hear that they're getting ready to carve her organs out. The whole situation is just very weird. But the thing that I was looking at was like the ritual dates, because it, took place in basically an ancient festival to Hecate, who was like a witch goddess. And Ellen came out on April 30th. That program was called The Puppy Show, of all things, because there's all these Sirius tie-ins again, Sirius and Flame and so on, the Burning Star and everything. That episode where Ellen came out in 1997 again aired on Walpurgis Night, which is basically the witches' Sabbath in Europe, and is very popular among people who practice what's called Dianic witchcraft, in particular. Heche is actually a derivative of Hecate. So you have that same kind of consonant sound between Hecate and Hecate. And then I connected it to, we talked about the situation at the Super Bowl, right?
Remind me.
Super Bowl back in 2015, when that woman was just basically incinerated. Like, she lost control of her car and it drove straight into the train tracks. Didn't we talk about this?
I don't think so.
We could do a whole show on this. It was one of the most horrific things you'll ever see. It was after Super Bowl 49. So there's the 49 again. The woman who is basically incinerated alive was 49 years old. She's hit by a train that's going 49 miles an hour. So there's all that symbolism there. And that ties to Liber 49, which is Babylon in like Jack Parsons' version of Thelema. So there are all these connections with witchcraft, but also that day that woman was basically incinerated. Her name was Ellen, by the way. Her name was Ellen Brody. Now, what's the significance of that? Ellen Brody was the name of the wife of the Roy Scheider character in Jaws. If you remember that Super Bowl, Katy Perry's dancing with the sharks.
Ah, yes.
For some bizarre reason. And before the Super Bowl, she says, jaws will drop and faces will melt. She didn't, I'm sure she was told to say that.
Yeah, of course.
You know what I'm saying? So this it takes place in Valhalla, New York.
Another hot topic right now.
Yeah, exactly, right? with Charlie Kirk. And it's pretty much right on the Hudson River. Katy Perry's real name is Katie Hudson. And that's when she came into the song Roar, and she's basically doing the Whore of Babylon. She's riding on this giant golden idol of a lion with these ruby red eyes, but she's also wearing a flame dress.
Yep.
Her dress is all flames, and she sang Firework. And again, Ellen means, did we mention that Ellen means torch?
No,
the name Ellen is derived from the Greek word for torch.
I just want to fold in a couple other things about this. So if we are kind of taking the premise that it seems like around 2022, there was a cleanup, maybe of people who could be called to trial, something like that. They're getting rid of people, getting rid of Twitch, getting rid of Anne Heche. Well, this is also the timeline of Obama's chef drowning in 2023. And you noted in that interview with Sam that Bill Clinton had a chef drown in 2015. So obviously a little off the timeline, but why did two presidents have chefs who drowned mysteriously? Maybe they could have been called to talk about things they were asked to prepare.
Or maybe it was just like a Buckley kind of ritual too,
Well, yeah, possibly. And then the other big thing, the twinning aspect. So Anne Heche's car hits a bungalow by the beach, a small little bungalow. We know these things. And you say that you think that the woman who lived there was supposed to die. She looks a lot like Anne Heche. You showed the side-by-side in that interview. So what are the chances that a person who lives in the house you hit looks a lot like you? Odd.
She also had the two dogs, and that connects to Hecate and to Sirius.
There you go. So this woman didn't die. And you say that another woman 4 days later was found hanging from a tree on fire in Griffith Park, and it was said to be a suicide. She was also a victim of sex trafficking, Vanessa Garcia. So if you're doing a ritual and you're trying to take this woman and give her a fiery death, because that's the ritual, and you hit this woman and it doesn't go right, you find another woman and you light her on fire and hang her from a tree, and you say, well, that works. It's basically completes the ritual.
That's how people commit suicide. They set themselves on fire and then they hang themselves. Or they hang themselves and they set themselves on fire. I'm not exactly sure what.
Yeah, what is the order?
The other thing too is that the cops didn't investigate and say it was suicide. The cops said right away that it was suicide. They just flat out said that it was suicide. And it wasn't like they said, oh, we have, surveillance video of her coming in alone with a can of gas and everything. They just said it was suicide. This is why I'm so glad you're out of California. And I just always tell people, particularly if they're in Los Angeles, to get the hell out of Los Angeles, because I just think it's become total dominion of demons, to be honest with you. But that story was absolutely nuts. But there are all these ritual dates with the dog days and so on. And also this connection to the Hecatean Ides, which is this festival to Hecate, who is known for the two dogs and the torch. So you ask about that woman who's not only basically
a human torch,
a twin of Anne Heche, but she had two dogs and her house gets set on fire. So the whole situation is just, it is one of the most disturbing things I've ever encountered, because with a lot of these stories, there's always sort of like an out. Like, okay, well, this looks bad, but there's some other explanation that we can make. There are so many moving parts with this story. And again, that connection to that situation with that woman in Valhalla in 2015, Ellen, who dies on the day of the Festival of Torches, by the way, which is also connected to Hecate and so on. It's basically a twin of the day that Anne Heche died on the Hecate, when she was declared dead on the Hecatean Ides. So the whole thing, there are just too many ritualized connections for me to say, oh, well, this is weird, but maybe it's just all syncs.
Well, a lot of people try to say the Anne Heche thing. They say that, well, if you're in trauma, you might jump up and that kind of thing. But that is not what it looks like to me. But if you watch the video, every comment section, top comment is saying like, well, when your body goes through a traumatic event like that, you don't know how it might react. And it's like, sure, go ahead and say that. That's your swamp gas weather balloon explanation. But what I saw is a woman who's like, don't shove me in this ambulance and don't cover me up. I want to get free.
She was trying to get away.
Yeah, and the guy doesn't act like he's surprised that she jumped up. If I'm pushing a gurney and someone jumps up, I'm like, whoa, look. You might get him to lay back down and stuff, but he has no reaction at all. He's just like subtly like go into the vehicle. So, but let me try to wrap a bow around this. So you also did a 2.5 hour, I think maybe 3 hour event the other night that was quite good. And I want to bring out a couple of little facts that draw a line between the beginning of the show and this Anne Heche thing here at the end of the show. And of course, the Sybil. Cocteau Twins have an album called Bluebell Knoll. Well, Boulder Mountain, also known as Bluebell Knoll, is in Utah, and it makes up half of the Aquarius Plateau of south central Utah in Wayne and Garfield counties. To get to Orem, where Charlie Kirk was shot, is less than 200 miles, and you have to drive right through Aurora to get there. James Shelby Downard, where are you? We need you. So then 5 blocks from where Charlie Kirk is assassinated is a best friends animal sanctuary. Why is that relevant? Well, it seems to be a front for something because, according to your slide, according to the FBI, David Berkowitz was a member of the Process Church and was associated with the individuals running the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. Leaders of the Best Friends Animal Sanctuary were allegedly involved with Berkowitz in several of the Son of Sam murders. And who's one of the big donors? Ellen and her wife. It never ends. It never ends, Chris.
No, it really doesn't. I'm going to be doing a live stream on the process because that's a story I've been following for a long time. I wrote a lot about the process in The Endless American Midnight, as you probably are well aware of. When I saw that situation with Charlie Kirk, and as you said, like just a few blocks away is Best Friends Animal. But you got to be very careful because they're extremely litigious.
Allegedly, supposedly. I mean, this is just what I heard online.
The thing, they're well known that they're an outgrowth of the Process Church. It was started by Marianne de Grimstead after she split up with Robert. But there was another split off in the Process Church, and where were their headquarters? Rockefeller Plaza. What an interesting place for a cult to have their headquarters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very, very strange connections there. With the Charlie Kirk thing, so you mentioned Bluebell Knoll, but there was also the fact that the Cocteau Twins played Utah a grand total of once, and their opening act was a band called Luna. Now, Luna is the name of who they claim is Tyler Robinson's trans boyfriend. His birth name is Lance, and he changed his name to Luna. Now, the Cocteau Twins were touring for an album that was released 4 days before Charlie Kirk was born. You know, it's basically the same week.
Same birthday as George Floyd, by the way. Couple of sacrifices, one for each team. Everybody pays the piper.
Well, it's interesting because I was going back and looking at a lot of my old tweets because I was trying to figure out why I got shadow banned on Twitter for so many years. And then I kind of realized, well, yeah, I was not going along with the program. I was writing all these tweets exposing BLM and Antifa and George Floyd worship. I believe we talked about on your show my big post on the connection with George Floyd and the some of the rituals that took place in the spring in the ancient world.
Yes, I do recall that.
You know, that it very much seemed like a fertility sacrifice, but that's probably why I got shadow banned on Twitter before Elon bought them.
Well, although the big ritual never ends, these interviews have to sometime. I'm on studio time now. I did expect this to be a fun talk about some pop culture 90s X-Files nostalgia, but it did break into the heavy reality of our times. This just happens. But thanks as always for doing it. Tell the fine folks at home where they can get the latest from the Secret Sun Institute, details about the book, all the rest of it.
The Secret Sun, Substack.com, secretsun.blogspot.com. You know, you can find all the other places that I am. The book is out now, Amazon. It's available in paperback, hardcover, and Kindle versions. The hardcover is huge. It's over 400 pages long, and there's a lot more of the kind of conspiracy and parapolitical stuff that we've been discussing in the expanded version. I'm sure most of your viewers know where to find me by now. I mean, I'm such a known quantity, right?
Yes, yes.
But again, yeah, just on Secret Sun Speaks on Twitter. I'm easy to find. I keep a high profile.
Well, if I had a Mount Crushmore, I'm sure you'd be on it, but unfortunately, that's been copywritten by someone else.
My 30th or 35th. I don't know how many times I've been on. Like,
it's just the Chris Knowles chats at this point, but you are the man. I appreciate it. Thanks for sending me a copy of the book. Anyone who's an X-Files fan or fan of the themes in the X-Files would learn a lot. Thanks again and take care. All right, guys. Well, that was fun, but I do know what you're thinking. How could I record a 2-hour interview with the Secret Son's wise sage of synchromysticism and not mention Snake Eyes? Maybe the most potently layered synchromystic pop culture conspiratorial event of all time. Well, easy. So we recorded this interview last week, and then later that afternoon, I hit him with the thread on Snake Eyes, and we were both blown away with each additional layer of detail. And then Chris did a members live stream that night, and I helped him get some of the facts together, and I hung out a bit for it, and it was great. He broke it all down and connected a lot of dots with the larger tapestry that he tends to cover, and it was just wild. But then yesterday, I recorded an interview with Richard Willett, who is Wayne McCroy's co-host for the Synchromystic podcast, and we covered it all, and he even blew my mind with some things I didn't know, like writer-director Brian De Palma, for Snake Eyes, of course, actually has his birthday as 9/11. Is anything real? So I'm kind of talking around this because I assume 80% of our listeners already know, and as I just said, I have this other interview where it is a big part of the show coming right up. Just to bring people up to speed, there is a Nicolas Cage movie from the 90s called Snake Eyes, and he plays a detective who is at a live boxing match on September 10th, and a senator named Charles Kirkland gets shot in the neck, and so you have the name, the date, and the method. If we were playing Clue, it would be game over. But it does go deeper still. The boxer who takes a dive as a distraction intentionally, his name is Lincoln, the executioner Tyler. And then also there's this Trump character where, you go to the IMDb trivia, and for a long time it's been known this character is based on Trump. It's not some new thing. It's not a stretch. And this character who is the billionaire who owns the casino, he's friends with the guy who got shot. And then as the film unfolds, it turns out he was in on it because Charles Kirkland wouldn't just go along with the plan. And you know how that goes. But it is very wild. Maybe the most layered, detailed example of sync ever. And also the movie Snake Eyes relating to a real event that took place in the year of the snake. And then the Charlie Kirk Memorial is at the State Farm Arena in Phoenix. And the only sports team I know of represented by a snake is the Arizona Diamondbacks. It is wild, but I'll have to just shut up or I'm repeating myself for the next episode. Though I think this is so crazy it deserves to be talked about more than twice. It is part of our secret sauce here, synchromysticism, But as for what this episode was actually about, we even have a weird sync with Charlie Kirk being shot on the 32nd anniversary of the X-Files airing. Isn't that odd? Sharing a birthday with George Floyd. It's all getting far too weird. And something is definitely up with the Best Friend's Pet Sanctuary. Funny, because when we finished recording this, my man in the booth was like, damn, not only was that a great interview, but that's where we got our dog, Best Friend's Pet Sanctuary. So it definitely hit him with a nice personal touch to cap it all off, and big congrats to Chris for getting this book out. It's very detailed. I know the X-Files might not be a big part of every listener's life anymore, but thematically, it is all there. And we tried to stick to the themes and inspirations and real-world events that were related to the show rather than the plot or behind-the-scenes drama and all that. I hoped that we could fold in a little something for everyone while paying our respects to the best of the best and the work that it takes to get a new project out. But I think we really stuck the landing, putting the Anne Heche stuff there at the end with the Ellen overlay and the Charlie Kirk shooting connection, bringing it back to the beginning. It really was full circle. Anyway, yes, some somewhat current events on the front and back end with a lot of great stuff related to the book in the middle. The second hour got into the Falklands War and extraterrestrial involvement and the Black Goo, which is a big theme in the X-Files. We talked about that latest Black Goo story from the kid who found the meteor. I think I even threw that up on the screen too, if the guys in the studio could find it. Hard to find the original footage, and I don't TikTok. I guess I have to. It's kind of part of the job now. But we went down a big list of unethical human experimentation throughout U.S. history. I brought up the St. Louis Pruitt-Igoe housing project and the sprayers people said they remember there and their health effects. And I mentioned at that part that my memory was fuzzy, but I was pretty sure that the architect of the Pruitt-Igoe building was the same main architect of the Twin Towers, and that fact is correct. I looked it up afterwards, and both of them have the same chief architect. And funny enough, both buildings went down in professional demolitions. We also talked about cults in the X-Files and in life, cultural shifts and the rise of the nerds and just what Judd Apatow did to all of us, the Kellogg's legacy and the food industry. We talked a little bit about how I really am into Matt Leshak's work, Leshak, the Fiat Food book that really talks about how getting us off the gold standard was a big part of trying to find some bullshit, cheap, cardboard-esque food that could hide that inflation. We talked about the whole drama with Scully's pregnancy and maybe some other stuff going on there. If you heard it, you heard it, and I hope you could read between the lines and all that. Sign up for Plus if you want to support a show that does it all without interruptions and unrelated sponsors or networks or managers or agents or anything. Links right there in the show notes. If you are an X-Files fan, you would love this book. The episode-by-episode guide really does give you a lot to think about. Going back through all the different episodes, I actually probably will go back through the series myself and just watch the ones that Chris gave 5 stars, because he does rate every episode too. All right. Oh, and I think at the end there, Chris had mentioned the Frazzle Drip inspired cartoon that Justin Roiland had made when we were talking about the idea that this video got out, this little piece of insurance, and they wanted to shut it down and maybe killed a bunch of people who knew anything about it if it did go to court and could be called upon. But Justin Roiland, yeah, apparently he made 2 videos that were allusions to the Frazzle Drip video, and one of them was Rick and Morty, and it was an actual Super Bowl commercial, and I went and watched that. It is for Pringles. Yeah, Chris is right. Morty's face comes off and he's a robot underneath. It does seem like Justin is trying to allude to that without getting caught. You know, you can't spell it out, so it's always going to be a little iffy. But I think I could see him as the kind of guy who would get a charge from coming right up to the line on something like that, especially during such a high-profile event. And that's one thing, but I want to play the non-Rick and Morty cartoon that he made. It is a lot more overt. And remember, cartoons take a lot of effort to make. For the audio listeners, I'm only going to play the relevant 30 seconds or so, and hearing it is really all you need. But a guy comes home from work and he has 2 kids tied up in his living room and gagged, and then he just pulls out a switchblade and cuts off their faces. Use your imagination.
The time has come for me to dispose of you. I've had my sexual fill, and I cannot allow your presence to distract me from my job as head writer and host of the wildly successful television show Unbelievable Tales. God forgive me! You're my inspiration. You're my inspiration. You're my inspiration.
Yeah. It is just so sickening. Why would a guy do this? Is it to reveal or is it to celebrate? Hard to say, but the PR machine definitely took him down right after he wouldn't shut up about this. Much like Charlie Kirk, if you start to say too much or the wrong things, then they just take away the audience that you were allowed to have one way or another. That's the world. All right, as far as higher side news goes, obviously I tried to rearrange my office here. It's a bit better for filming wrap-ups. I still do have some work to do, but that whole long shot across the entire room, that was very weird. I wanted to fix that. But everybody films in this sort of way where they're backed up right to a wall, and think about how unnatural that is. Now my desk is in the center of the room, but I guess it has to serve its function. Anyway, this is at least progress. I still don't think you can really read the titles of the books on the wall, and that would be nice if you could. So the shelf needs to be organized, but whatever. What else? I don't know if there's really anything else. Pretty standard stuff. Don't fix it if it ain't broke, right? So let's do the review thing for the last episode. Richard Grove, he was really good if you ask me. Some people were critical of his ego, but I don't mind the little ego if it's earned. I've talked to a lot of guests who wrote mediocre books one time, and I don't understand why their ego is so inflated, or, various reasons. But Richard had great recall, and he had a source book for pretty much everything, and then he presented things really well. Audio listeners didn't see this, but when Richard would reference a book, he could typically grab it off the shelf and then put it down and cut to a different camera that would display the cover. I mean, who does that? That's going the extra mile. So I appreciated the attention to detail. I thought he did a great job. Even when I asked him about a few things outside of his wheelhouse, like the secret societies and what the secrets are, and occultists and all that stuff. That's not exactly his layer of the conspiracy, but the plus listeners were impressed. He got a 4.7, and that makes sense. He was very good. So I'm glad that we are in alignment there, and I put out a show that was well liked. That's all I'm trying to do. Now, as for the meetup calendar, 2 new events have been added. Let's get into that. All right, October 8th at the Coal Bitter Collective at Riverscape Metro Park in Dayton, Ohio. October 9th, New Haven, Connecticut, 3 Sheets. That's where it's going down. October 17th in Elkin, North Carolina at the Rail Yard. Okay, and I thought I saw another one here. Oh, September 28th. That's actually today. If you still have time to attend, it is tonight at 6 o'clock. If you're in Portland, Oregon, go to Bunk Bar. And Portland's in the news, actually. Stay safe. Stay out of it. Don't let yourself get swept up in craziness. And I'm not trying to say that if we just keep letting it go, that totalitarian, authoritarian stuff won't get worse. It probably will. But just stay safe. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. Anyway, that is tonight at Bunk Bar, if they're still open, in Portland, Oregon. All right. I think Higher Side Chats fans are pretty savvy when it comes to navigating stuff like that without getting too emotionally riled up. I don't know. I'm kind of just bullshitting because I haven't really looked at it that much except to see that it was a trend and that it's because the troops are coming out and they're going for Antifa, which I don't even think is a real organization with a headquarters or anything. It's just kind of a vague thing like terrorist. And we know how the game is played. You use a vague term so you can basically do whatever you want in the name of getting X, Y, or Z. Anyway, stay safe out there, and it's nice to see a couple more events added to the calendar. It's great to meet like-minded local people and put the screens down for a while, especially when things are heating up. And that's basically the show. Thanks for keeping me in your rotation. I know there's a never-ending stream of attention-seeking content, so sticking with me is much appreciated. Take care of you and yours. Big thanks to Chris as well. I have done my part. Your move, synchromistic pop culture template takers, conspiratorial showrunners, and engineers of those so-called real-world events. Your fucking move.
Chris says AI is useless. He thinks that it's all hype. But has he tried to make a song from whatever he can type? It may be just a parlor trick, but life is just a parlor. And with every passing moment, we're pushing this shit farther. The secret's are so fun, decoding all the things. The secret's on second to none, something in the wire sings. Sun Institute, a prestigious place to learn, and a cozy, comfy, happy place to watch the world burn. The stupid sorcerarchy will drive us through the ground, and the people will be thankful that they had Chris Knowles around. The secret sun, so fun, decoding all the things. The secret sun, second to none, something in the wires sings. The secret sun, so fun, decoding all the things. The secret sun, second to none, something in the wires.